Welcome everyone to First Principles Podcast. This is the episode on the carnivore diet. Now, what in tarnation is the carnivore diet? Well, it's a diet that's been coming into a lot of popularity recently. A lot of people have been uptaking it. There's been a lot of podcasts that have been dedicated towards it. And what it essentially is what it sounds like. You're eating meat. It's just strictly eating meat. There's no vegetables. There's no fruits. There's no carbs. No nothing associated with it. No bread. No muffins. Forget about your muffins. I love me some muffins. But none of that. Forget about it. And we're only eating meat.
Yeah. Someone put it, if it walks, swims, or flies, that's what you're eating.
There you go.
Yeah.
There you go. Those are the simple criteria. So I don't know. What are your initial thoughts on it going into this, Elliot?
Well, first off, I want to just highlight that some of the claims why people are having this diet or, adapting this diet is they're saying that it's helping cure them of their autoimmune diseases or conditions, trying to lose weight on this diet. People have gone as far as to claim that it's helped relieve them of their depression symptoms as well.
Depression. Yeah.
But what we're not going to do is dive into that side of things. We're not going to look at this from, is it a healthy diet or not? What we're interested in is how much environmental impact is associated with this diet type.
Right. We don't care about the health implications. We don't care if it's good for you, bad for you. It may be both. It may be neither. I don't know. I'm not a doctor. It is what it is. What we want to look at, neither of us are doctors.
Yeah.
Just put that out there. If it's not obvious already. But what we want to talk about specifically are the environmental implications associated with a purely carnivore-based diet. So what would be the carbon footprint associated with eating purely meat as 100% of your calorie intake throughout the day, throughout the year? What are the implications in terms of water consumptions, your CO2 footprint, the land area required to grow the sustenance that you need to keep yourself going to meet your fundamental energy requirements. Those are the questions that we want to get into, those nitty-gritty little details.
And I want to just add one thing there. Is like, we've chosen the carnivore diet because it is kind of going through this fad period, and it's interesting to us right now. It's not here to bash meat, bash diets that have meat as part of them. Like, we are not vegans. We're not here to promote that.
I eat meat. I just ate some bacon.
It was delicious.
Yeah.
So,
I love me my meat. I love me my barbecues, 100%. Yeah.
Yeah. So in this podcast, that's not the purpose of it, but we're just genuinely curious. What would be the effect, the impact of eating a carnivore diet? That's what we're interested in.
Right. Just looking at the numbers. We're not some crazy vegans trying to convince you to forget about meat. It's going to be the end of the world. Cow farts are going to be the death of the human civilizations. No, we're not those types of people. So if those are the types of people that you're looking for in order to have some sort of confirmation bias or whatever, that's not what we're going to be giving you.
Elsewhere. Look elsewhere.
Yeah, but so we wanted to essentially look at, if for the average Western individual, if you're trying to get 2,500 calories a day in order to maintain your basic energy demands, what would that translate to in terms of how much meat you would need on a yearly basis? Now, what we did was look at specifically cows, and if you were to eat just strictly beef, what would that mean in terms of how much beef you would need in a year to sustain your basic diet of 2,500 calories in a day? And what we found was that you would essentially need about 1.4 cows per year. So 1.4 cows per year. And it's, I don't know, when you look at that, I don't know how that number sounds to you, Elliot, when you just hear that number. But, you could, I guess, meet your basic calories with 1.4 cows. But what does that mean in terms of the area that cow requires in order to grow and just stay healthy within a year? And what we calculated was that their one cow would need 2.8 acres per year per person. So again, 1.4 cows, that would take up about 2.8 acres per person per year. So to sustain yourself, that's what you would be essentially looking at. You need 2.8 acres. That's how much your diet would be taking up.
And correct me if I'm wrong, that's based on a cow that's being raised on a pasture.
Right. So this would be a cow that's raised with, maybe more not so much industrial techniques where you're trying to huddle in your cows and optimize for space, but this is more traditional pasture-based farming where there's a bit more free range that's associated with the cows and their captivity. Which we found the general rule of thumb was 1.5 to 2 acres that you would need per cow. So that's how we got to that number of 2.8 acres.
And that number takes into account basically the amount of grass that needs to grow to feed the cow in the summertime, plus create a surplus that you can harvest to feed it during the winter when the grass isn't growing.
Exactly. So just some basic calculations, nothing too crazy. And we wanted to look at what the implications of the area would be that's required in order to sustain a population that's primarily based off the carnivore diet. So say, for example, if 1% of the population were to jump onto the carnivore diet, how much of our farmable land would that consume to sustain that 1%? What we found was for 1% of the population to be turned to carnivore, that would mean in Canada, that would lead to 3.7% of our farmable land being used for the carnivore diet folks. So in the US, that number is even worse, actually, because they have relatively less farmable land from what it seems. Or maybe it's not that, but it's their population, actually. So it's,
greater population.
Yeah, I think it's more so the population that's the biggest issue, is that they're, it's a whole order of magnitude greater than Canada. But if 1% of the population in the US was to become carnivore based, so again, strictly meat, no vegetables, no fruits, no carbs, no nothing, 6% of the land would need to be used up for growing this cattle, for growing the meat necessary. And then when we look at 10%, we have 37% respectively and 60%. And so it's pretty crazy right from there when we have, just something as small as 10% of the population becoming purely carnivore based. And, in the US, that's already 60% of the total land that's farmable will be used for that. And in Canada, 37%, so almost 40%. To me, those are huge numbers in terms of the land that's required in order to sustain this type of diet.
Yeah.
What do you think of that number there, Elliot?
Yeah, I mean, just on the surface there, you are seeing just how unsustainable this is. I mean, at 10%, you can't imagine 100% of people doing this. It's just not possible.
I mean, at 50%, we're already at 185% of the available land in Canada and 300% of the available farmable land in Canada. So all that to say that essentially we cannot afford to have a large portion of the population eating strictly meat. I guess that's essentially the conclusion that I'm sort of coming to.
Yeah, and we are looking at the worst case scenario. So, in the sense that we are looking just simply at beef, and they tend to be on terms of the land required to raise cattle and to slaughter them and all that.
Right. So beef is generally the worst in terms of the energy that's required per gram, in terms of the water that's consumed per gram. So this is really, the worst case scenario that we're looking at for our carnivore diet. If you were to, for example, have a carnivore diet strictly based off of chicken, then that would be a different story. Your relative impact in terms of the area that will be consumed, the farmable area that will be consumed would be much lower. But nonetheless, this is to give us kind of like an upper boundary, an upper range to play around with. So kind of like the worst case scenario. And yeah, it really demonstrates how impactful this has a potential to be in terms of the area. And not only that, but of course the carbon footprint that is associated with eating a strictly meat diet, because there is a carbon footprint both associated with the cows themselves, with their methane production, but not only that, which is what it is, but not only that, with all of the machinery and all the technology that's used in order to grow and feed these cows. So when you factor all these variables in, what we found was that on a yearly basis, actually no, per day, we broke it down per day eventually, was the mass of CO2 that will be produced per person per day would be about 31 kilograms. So 31 kilograms of CO2 per person per day. That is the CO2 production if you were to eat strictly beef for your entire calorie intake. Now, when we compare that to something that, we might have some sort of relative basis of understanding with, so for example, with our automobile use, with our gasoline consumption, what we found was that the average person, I believe this was based off of the US consumption of vehicle use. So this is, again, I think probably on the upper end, because that's probably like the culture where the car is probably like the most central role in terms of how people commute on a daily basis. So what we found was that on average, a person would be producing 10.5 kilograms of CO2 per day. So in terms of automobile use, you'd be producing 10.5 kilograms of CO2 per day. But in terms of your diet, you'd be producing 31 kilograms of CO2 per day. So almost literally 3 times as much of a carbon footprint when you have your car, regular automobile use versus your diet. So again, it kind of really shows the environmental implications of a diet that is strictly based off of meat. If you're only consuming beef specifically, you really see that there is an environmental cost that's quite great associated with it. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, what I think is important to highlight here is that so many of us, the way that we consume meat is we are so separated from the process. Right. By the time we go to the grocery store and pick the steak off the shelf there, it's we've met it at such a downstream position in a sense. With a car, there is the ability to look out the window and see the tailpipe of the car beside you, the exhaust coming out of it, and there's your CO2. But when you think about eating a steak for supper and lunch, you're not really thinking, holy shit, this is actually, the emissions associated with what I'm consuming right now is greater than what I had done today when I was traveling to the market to pick it up.
Yeah, exactly. Like, it's not something that we think of on a daily basis. What our environmental footprint is with regards to some of the decisions that we're making. And I think that that's an issue where people really need to have that mindset where we're consciously aware of what are we doing, what are the steps that every individual is taking in order to ensure that their carbon footprint, their water consumption, whatever it may be, is that it aligns with their ideology. So if you're one of those people that's screaming and shouting for government, for big corporations, for big oil to do something about the environment, well, then you yourself need to be doing something about the environment and ensuring that comes from your own individual carbon footprint. And by being aware of these types of things, like for example, how much CO2 is my diet really contributing, how much water consumption is associated with the diet that I'm consuming. And that's another thing that we actually looked at, was the water consumption that would be associated with a strictly carnivore diet. So again, obviously cattle, beef, they require water for both consuming and growing the grass that they're eating. So what we eventually found out was that, per person per year, if you were to consume the carnivore diet, eat strictly beef, that would lead to over 5 million liters of water consumption, which translates into 2 Olympic-sized swimming pools worth of water. So that's how much water you would need to feed those cows that you would be that 1.4 cow that you would need in order to sustain your diet. So again, 2.8 Olympic swimming pools, just to give a kind of a basis of comparison that people might have some sort of frame of reference. But yeah, that's essentially the amount of water that's just with the meat that you're consuming. That doesn't factor in the water consumption that you regularly need for sustenance or whatever,
bathing.
Mm-hmm. That's just the water consumption associated with your diet. 5 million liters of water, or 2 Olympic swimming pools. It's interesting just to have those numbers kind of put into a context that's relatable, that we can think of. But again, it really showcases that there is a cost associated with the daily decisions that we make, those diets that we take. And what we'll do is provide a comparison of that. So we gave the upper range in terms of eating strictly beef, but what would that mean, and how would that compare to the average diet that is not consuming, like just straight beef on a daily basis? And Elliot has some of those numbers that he's going to talk about, so we can have kind of like a base of comparison.
Yeah, we thought that that's absolutely essential for this conversation, is to have a sense of what is the baseline diet like, how does it compare when you look at the numbers. So what we had to do is come up with a diet scenario that we thought was baseline, and so what we came up with was a diet that is 50% of your calorie needs are met through consumption of chicken, okay, and 25% is through rice. 22.5 and another 22.5% is through potatoes, and the last little bit there, 2.5%, is met through cabbage. So we took the calorie densities of all these different food items, add them all up, looked at our average person needs 2,500 calories per day per person, and worked at how much weight is that per person for each food item. For something like rice, we're talking 175 kilograms a year per person. And something like chicken, we're talking 144 chickens based on the average weight of a chicken. Mm-hmm. For space, raising chickens takes up a lot less space. So we looked at 2 different scenarios here. One where you had basically a battery cages system. Okay, those birds only need about 0.2 meters squared per chicken. So that requirement, if you were to expand that for a year for one person, is 25 meters cubed per person. Okay, and then if you were to look at chickens being raised free range, so they get to go out and peck on the bugs and grass out in the farmland, you're talking
a happy old chicken life.
Happy chickens are good chickens.
Instead of being crammed and sitting on each other in like tech cages and
instead of being squashed. And so they need a bit more room, but it's not considerably a lot more. It's 1.3 meters cubed per bird, which works out to about 175 meters cubed per year per person.
Was that 1.3 versus 0.2?
Yeah, that was 1.3 versus,
Well, I mean, that's 6 times more, right? That's, damn, 6 times more room.
For sure. It is a lot more room. But I mean, in perspective of somebody having a little bit of property, the chances that you could actually raise your own chickens and meet to half your calorie intake for a year, it doesn't seem unrealistic,
right,
based on those numbers.
It's feasible.
Feasible for sure. We also took a look again at how does that compare to the farm land needed? So if you had 100% of the population in Canada or the US adapting this diet, land use wise, of the land use that's assigned to agriculture, it would only take up 4% in Canada and 6% in the US.
4%. That's crazy.
And that's 100% of the population adapting the diet.
So just as a reminder, when I talked about the carnivore diet and the land consumption associated with that, if, say, for example, 50% of the population were to adopt it in Canada, that was already 185% of the land that's devoted to agriculture, and in the US, that's 300%. So essentially, it's not feasible. But over here, when we look at the other diet substitute that we have, the alternative, when we have 100% of the population adopting that specific diet, we're only consuming 4%.
Yeah,
4% of the land that's devoted for agriculture. So you can see a huge difference associated between the two. That's crazy.
And this continues on. Like when we look at the CO2 emissions per day per person for this mixed diet scenario, we have it at basically 6 kilograms of CO2 per day per person, which in comparison to the car, which was at 10.5 kilograms of CO2, which in comparison to the carnivore, which was 30, right? Kilograms.
30.
So, considerably less.
Like 5 times less. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's crazy.
And then lastly, we, looked at the water for this, and even with the water needs for rice paddies and growing potatoes and cabbage and watering chickens, you are only looking at about 0.5 Olympic swimming pools per year per person. I mean, I say only loosely there because I still think that's a fair amount. It's a fair amount. Half an Olympic pool.
Yeah. It's no 2 Olympic swimming pools.
It's true.
Like the carnivore diet.
Yeah.
I mean, we're looking at a quarter of the amount of volume, but nonetheless 0.5. Yeah.
So, and one more thing I wanted to stress here, because we talked a little earlier about taking in this information and being mindful about our what we eat based off this information. But I think we should make it clear that we understand that there's a lot of people who their income and their choices and their food products are more limited than the others. Like realistically, people that are doing the carnivore diet have some money. It's not a
right.
It's not cheap to buy meat.
Right.
So
it's an expensive habit to sustain.
Yeah. And I know that other people are pressed for money. I also feel though that sometimes people can do more to choose vegetables or meals that include vegetables and stuff like that over just buying fast food. But there are restrictions based on price that limit people from trying these different diets, and people do the best with what they got. For sure.
100%. So next time you're at Burger King and you're thinking about getting that burger, grab the chicken burger instead of the beef burger, because all of a sudden your environmental emissions are going to be way lower. Way lower.
Yeah.
The environmental footprint is going to be a lot less, so you can at least feel a bit better about yourself morally. But all that to say, I still love my beef burgers as well. I can't hate.
Yeah, and everything in moderation. I mean, eating a steak once a month is a blip compared to eating it 2 times a day. I mean, realistically.
Yeah, exactly. Which is essentially what some of these people are advocating for, just essentially having a steak for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And that's why we essentially used the strictly beef diet as our upper range of the environmental emissions that we looked at. So if you're just eating steak morning, afternoon, evening, there are some serious implications associated with that. And it's just important for us to be mindful of them, not to say that one is better or worse. Again, health wise, do what's best for you, what's best for your health, if you feel like it's helping you with your autoimmune diseases, whatever it may be. But there are certain questions, moral and ethical questions, to be considered here, and we get to premise of, tragedy of the commons, which is the idea that, we might be able to do something for our own individual selves that's convenient for us, but that individual action kind of puts the general community at a disadvantage. So, we need to almost take certain steps where it might not be the ideal choice for us in terms of our own personal benefits, but in terms of the, overall society and community that we live in, it might be a better choice to reduce even though you might love to eat steak every day, it might be better to reduce that and eat it maybe once a week or every so often, as opposed to for morning, lunch, dinner, whatever.
Yeah, and I mean, to make that super clear, those consequences of you eating meat every day don't just affect other people. If you're like, I don't give a fuck about my neighbor, whatever, right? But I mean, it's these problems that are created will inevitably affect everybody, including everyone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. So we'll continue on the discussion of diet and how that links to the environment. What is the environmental footprint associated with different types of diets? We might explore, how introducing things such as bug protein, cricket protein, what are the environmental implications of that? But if you guys have any ideas of, different diets that you'd like us to look at and what the environmental implications of those diets are, feel free to let us know. Please respond in the comments. Let us know what you think of this episode, and please subscribe, and we'll catch you later.
Peace.
So once again, that was First Principle Podcast, the Carnivore Diet. As a summary, we looked at the amount of cows that would be necessary to sustain an individual if they were to consume all their calories on a daily basis from cattle, from beef, which was 1.4 cows per year per person. That would translate into 2.8 acres per year per person. So that's the land area that would be necessary in order to sustain that cow.
And comparing that to our baseline diet, which consisted of a 50% chicken, to cover your calorie intake, that the land needed for that diet was 0.2 acres per year per person.
Yes. Looking at the CO2 footprint, found that if based on the carnivore diet, you would be consuming producing 31 kilograms of CO2 per person per day. Comparing that to a car and your daily average automobile consumption, your gasoline consumption, which is 10.5 kilograms of CO2 per day. So again, 3 times as much CO2 being produced from your carnivore diet. And compared to the baseline diet,
5.6 kilograms.
5.6 kilograms, so 6 times as much. When we looked at the water, so what would be the water that will be consumed by the cows that are necessary to sustain yourself on a yearly basis? That was 5 million liters of water, which translates into 2 Olympic-sized swimming pools per person per year. So that's how much water you would need in order to feed those cows to sustain yourself. So that's not including any of the water that you would need yourself as an individual for your own consumption.
That's right. And compared to the baseline, which is only 0.5 Olympic swimming pools, which is considerably less.
Much less, a quarter. Yes. So again, that was the First Principles Carnivore Podcast. Let us know what you think in the comments. Please share, please subscribe, and we'll catch you later.
Peace. Oh yeah, where the fuck am I?